Across millennia of shifting kingdoms and forgotten civilizations, one collection of writings continued to move forward, quietly, steadily, with a resilience unmatched by any other ancient text. From tents in the desert to royal courts, from stone tablets to parchment scrolls, from whispers spoken around campfires to pages stored in monasteries, the words that would one day form the Bible journeyed through the vast landscape of human history. How did these writings endure? How did they survive times when nations fell, languages faded, and cultures were swept away? And what allowed these words, first spoken in dusty marketplaces and small villages, to be gathered, protected, and shared across continents long before printing presses or global literacy existed? Long before the Bible became a single volume, it was a living library, shaped by prophets who carried messages they believed were given from beyond themselves, by kings who recorded victories and failures, by wise teachers who wrestled with life's deepest questions, and by followers of Jesus who documented his life with a clarity and conviction that reshaped the world. Each voice contributed to a story far larger than the circumstances in which they spoke. Yet behind the familiar pages lies a process most people rarely consider. How were these writings recognized as sacred? What standards were used to preserve them? Why were some writings embraced by generations of believers while others were set aside? The early guardians of Scripture paid extraordinary attention to accuracy, often copying each letter with a level of care modern readers seldom imagine, counting lines, comparing manuscripts, and ensuring that even the smallest detail was handled with precision. Their work laid the foundation for the Scriptures held today. As the centuries unfolded, communities scattered across regions found the same passages meaningful, the same prophecies compelling, and the same narratives essential for understanding the unfolding revelation they believed God was giving. This shared recognition formed the canon, not through sudden decisions, but through long observation of which writings consistently shaped faith, instruction, and truth. And so an ancient question emerges in every generation. How do we know that the Bible we read today reflects what was originally written? The answer lies in thousands of manuscripts, spanning different locations and time periods, allowing scholars to compare, verify, and reconstruct the original words with remarkable clarity. The more these manuscripts surfaced, the more they affirmed the stability and preservation of the text. Instead of drifting from its source, the Scriptures show a level of consistency that continues to astonish experts. But the story does not end with preservation. It reaches deeper, into the ways these writings were translated, carried across borders, taught to new cultures, and defended during times when owning a copy could cost someone their life. It raises questions that strike at the very heart of faith and history. Why were certain books included and others not? How did the words of ancient prophets reach modern pages? And how do we know the Bible we read today hasn't been changed? These questions push us to explore not just the history of a book, but the endurance of a message that has traveled through languages, continents, and generations. Today we trace its path, from the first moments the words were spoken, to the manuscripts carefully guarded, to the translations that shaped nations. This is the story of how the Bible came to be and why it still stands at the center of global conversation. Long before any passage of Scripture was written, the earliest revelations were carried through spoken tradition. Families preserved their history by rehearsing it aloud, repeating the accounts of creation, the early patriarchs, the covenant with Abraham, and the Great Flood. In the ancient world, memory was a disciplined practice. These spoken accounts were treated with reverence, guarded by elders, and transmitted with precision so the identity of the people would remain anchored in the works of God. This oral foundation existed for centuries until the moment came when God instructed his people to begin recording his words. As Exodus records, "Write this for a memorial in a book," a command signaling the transition from spoken remembrance to written preservation. From this point forward, writing became an essential means of safeguarding divine instruction. Moses is traditionally recognized as the first major writer of what would later be known as the Torah or the Law. These earliest writings included Israel's origin story, the covenant laws, the journey out of Egypt, and the unfolding of God's promises. They were recorded using the materials available in the ancient Near East: papyrus beaten from reeds, ink made from soot and plant gum, and a stylus used to form characters in early Hebrew script. These written records were not casual notes. They were deliberate, careful inscriptions meant to endure. Their purpose was simple yet vital: to ensure that the covenant, the history, and the instructions of God would not be lost as generations passed. The formation of Scripture continued through Israel's history as scribes and priests became guardians of the written word. They copied the texts with remarkable precision, counting letters, lines, and spacing to ensure accuracy. When mistakes occurred, entire sections were rewritten rather than preserved with flaws. This culture of meticulous transmission is supported by thousands of manuscripts found across centuries, which show extraordinary consistency in the biblical text. The discovery of ancient scrolls preserved in desert caves only strengthened this, revealing that even texts copied over 1,000 years apart remained strikingly aligned. As Israel grew, prophets were raised up who spoke messages they believed were given by God. These messages were recorded, preserved, and recognized as carrying the same authority as the earlier writings. Historical events, royal records, temple instructions, songs of worship, and wisdom teachings were all written with a clear purpose: to bear witness to God's actions and guidance throughout the nation's life. Each contribution expanded the growing collection of sacred writings that would eventually form the Hebrew Scriptures. Through times of wandering, kingdom building, exile, and return, these writings survived. They were read in gatherings, stored in sacred spaces, and copied again and again to protect them from loss. Over centuries, the consistent recognition of these books across the nation, by priests, prophets, and entire communities, formed the basis of what later generations would call the Old Testament. This is how Scripture began: through ancient memories spoken with care, through commandments recorded with intention, through histories and prophecies written to preserve truth, and through generations who treated these words as a treasure to protect. The story of the Bible's earliest formation is not one of chance, but of continual preservation, careful transmission, and unwavering commitment to ensuring that what was given in the beginning would remain for those who would come long after. As the earliest writings of Scripture took shape, the foundation of the Old Testament began with the books traditionally attributed to Moses, what would later be called the Torah. These 5 books, written around 1400 to 1200 BC according to long-standing understanding, captured the heart of Israel's identity. The origin of the world, the shaping of the covenant, the deliverance from Egypt, and the laws meant to guide a nation set apart. These texts did not simply record events, they provided a framework for life, law, worship, and the relationship between God and His people. Generation after generation looked to these writings as the bedrock of their faith. They explained where humanity came from, how Israel was chosen, and what it meant to walk in obedience. As time moved forward, the story of the nation continued to unfold in written form. The books that followed, known today as the historical writings, documented Israel's journey from the moment they stepped into the Promised Land. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings described conquests, leaders, victories, failures, and the rise and fall of monarchy. They reveal how the nation wrestled with faithfulness and rebellion, and how those choices shaped their destiny. Later writings, such as Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, offer a different vantage point, capturing the rebuilding of the nation after exile, the restoration of worship, and the determination of a people returning to their homeland. These texts are grounded in real events, supported by archaeological findings and cultural records that line up with the eras they describe. Alongside these historical accounts, a rich body of poetic and wisdom writings emerged. These books speak to the inner life of the people, how they worshipped, questioned, lamented, and sought understanding. The Psalms echo the prayers and songs of kings, prophets, priests, and ordinary worshippers who poured out their hearts to God. Proverbs offers guidance shaped by generations of observation and reflection. Job explores the deep mystery of suffering and righteousness. These writings stretch across centuries, capturing the emotional and spiritual landscape of Israel. Within them, timeless truths appear, including the familiar declaration, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path," a reminder of how Scripture guided the people through every season of life. As the centuries progressed, God raised up prophets whose words carried authority and urgency. These men spoke during times of national tension, foreign invasion, moral decline, and spiritual renewal. Their messages were written down as a record of divine instruction, correction, and hope. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets delivered warnings about judgment and promises of restoration. They pointed forward to a coming Redeemer, describing a future in which God would restore His people and establish righteousness. Their writings were rooted in the circumstances of their day, yet they reached far beyond their own lifetimes, carrying themes that resonated through generations. Through all these diverse writings, law, history, poetry, and prophecy, Hebrew scriptures grew over a long stretch of time. Importantly, they were not compiled by a single council or chosen through a sudden decision. Instead, the recognition of these books happened gradually and naturally as the people of Israel used them in worship, studied them in their gatherings, and passed them down through families. Scrolls that carried clear prophetic authority, historical accuracy, and consistent teaching became central to the nation's understanding of God. Communities across different regions recognized the same writings as sacred, not because someone told them to, but because these books prove themselves over and over again through their reliability, spiritual depth, and alignment with the unfolding revelation. By the time these writings were firmly established, the Jewish people had long treated them as the authoritative scriptures, 39 books preserved with remarkable care. They stood as the foundation of their worship, their identity, and their understanding of God's work in the world. These books formed the Old Testament as it is known today, a collection shaped not by human decision alone, but by centuries of recognition, devotion, and preservation. After the final words of the prophet Malachi were recorded, the people of Israel entered a period often described as silent, not because God was absent, but because no new prophetic writings were added to their scriptures. This period stretched for about 400 years, bridging the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the Gospels. Yet this era was far from empty. It was a time of enormous change, shaping the world into which Jesus would later be born, and influencing the context in which the New Testament would emerge. During these centuries, the ancient world shifted under the rise of Greek power. The conquests of Alexander the Great spread a unified culture across vast territories. Greek language, ideas, and education began to influence every region, including the land of Israel. As Greek became the common language of commerce and learning, many Jewish communities living outside the homeland adopted it for daily life. This cultural change led to a crucial development in biblical history. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. This translation, known later as the Septuagint, made the sacred writings accessible to the wider Jewish world and eventually to early Christians who spoke Greek as their primary language. It became one of the most significant influences on how Scripture was read and understood in the centuries that followed. This period also saw the growth of various Jewish writings, historical accounts, wisdom texts, and apocalyptic literature that reflected the struggles and hopes of the people. These works were not added to Scripture, but they reveal how deeply the people wrestled with foreign rule, identity, faithfulness, and the longing for deliverance. They describe the courage of those who defended their traditions, the tensions with surrounding cultures, and the anticipation of a coming Messiah who would restore the nation. These writings give modern readers a window into the spiritual atmosphere into which the New Testament would later speak. Politically, the region changed hands repeatedly, from Greek rulers to local families who fought for independence, and eventually to Roman control. Each shift shaped daily life in Israel, influencing language, laws, worship practices, and expectations for the future. The rise of different Jewish groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and others, grew out of this era as the people responded in various ways to foreign influence and internal pressure. Their interpretations of Scripture, their traditions, and their hopes for God's intervention developed along distinct paths, all contributing to the religious landscape Jesus would later address. Though no new prophetic books were written during these centuries, the groundwork for the New Testament was laid in profound ways. The spread of the Greek language prepared a common platform for the message of Jesus to travel swiftly across the world. The translation of the Hebrew Scriptures allowed the early church to quote and teach from a text understood by people in many nations. And the longing for God's promised Messiah grew stronger, shaping the expectations of a people waiting for redemption. These years may have appeared quiet on the surface, but beneath them was a movement of history, culture, language, and spiritual hunger that set the stage for the arrival of the gospel story. When the New Testament era opened, it did so in a world shaped by centuries of preparation, culturally unified, spiritually expectant, and ready for the next chapter in the unfolding story of Scripture. When the silence of the intertestamental years came to an end, it did so with the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher whose words would reshape history. During his ministry, Jesus taught through spoken messages, parables, and proclamations delivered to crowds on hillsides, in synagogues, in homes, and along dusty roads. His teachings were carried first through the memories of those who heard him, disciples, eyewitnesses, and followers who walked beside him. Their first-hand experiences would later become the foundation upon which the written Gospels were built. One of those Gospel writers would explain the purpose of this written testimony, saying, "These are written that you may believe," revealing the intention behind preserving these accounts for future generations. After Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, the early church grew rapidly across the Roman world. As communities formed in cities such as Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, and Rome, the apostles began writing letters to guide these new believers. Paul, once an opponent of the Christian movement, became one of its most influential voices. His letters, written between AD 50 and 67, addressed real concerns: faith, unity, morality, leadership, and theology. These writings showed a church learning how to follow Christ in diverse cultures, often facing opposition. Other apostles added their voices as well. Letters from Peter, John, James, and Jude offered teaching, correction, and encouragement, preserving their guidance long after their lifetimes. As the movement spread, the need for written accounts of Jesus' life became increasingly important. The earliest of these is traditionally understood to be the Gospel of Mark, shaped by the memories of those who witnessed the events firsthand. Matthew and Luke followed, each gathering testimonies, preserved oral traditions, and written sources to present a full picture of Jesus' life, ministry, and teachings. Finally, the Gospel of John emerged with a unique approach, highlighting themes of identity, belief, and the deeper meaning of Christ's works. Each Gospel was crafted with careful intention, rooted in eyewitness experience, and shaped by the conviction that these events carried enduring truth. Together, they provided a reliable and unified portrayal of Jesus from different perspectives. As these writings appeared, the early followers of Jesus recognized their value immediately. Churches began copying the letters and Gospels, sharing them from city to city. A letter written to one congregation was soon read in many others, becoming part of a growing collection of sacred Christian writings. Communities treated these documents with reverence, preserving them, memorizing portions, and using them in teaching and worship. The writings were copied by hand and carried across regions, forming a network of manuscripts that allowed the message of Christ to spread rapidly. By the early 2nd century, the core of the New Testament writings was already firmly in place. Collections of Paul's letters were circulating together. The 4 Gospels were recognized widely and read side by side. Christian teachers quoted these writings as authoritative long before any formal lists were assembled. The remarkable agreement across distant communities, spread throughout the Roman Empire, shows how consistently these books were received. They were treasured not because a council demanded it, but because believers recognized in them the authentic voice of those who had walked with Jesus and witnessed his works. In this way, the New Testament began, not as a single volume created at once, but as a collection of faithful testimonies, letters, and accounts formed in real time during the earliest decades of the Christian movement. These writings captured the teachings of Jesus, the experiences of his followers, and the guidance of the apostles. They preserved a message that would cross languages, cultures, and generations, standing at the heart of the faith for centuries to come. As the writings of the apostles continued to spread through the early Christian world, a natural question began to take shape. Which of these texts carried the true voice of the faith? The earliest believers did not make this decision lightly. They already held the Hebrew Scriptures in profound respect, and they approached the new writings with the same seriousness. Over time, the churches learned to recognize which books carried the unmistakable authority of those who had walked with Jesus or been directly taught by those who did. Writings connected to the apostles stood out immediately. These were not opinions or reflections. They were testimonies rooted in first-hand experience and divine commission. Another key marker was consistency. Any writing that contradicted the message already known from the teachings of Jesus and the earlier scriptures was set aside. Truth carries unity, and the churches looked for that unity across the unfolding story of God's work. The teachings of the apostles harmonized with the long history of God's revelation, and this harmony became a sign of authenticity. Communities across distant regions began using the same writings, reading them openly in worship, teaching from them, and passing them to new believers. Their widespread use served as a confirmation that these texts were already recognized as trustworthy and spiritually vital. Believers also paid attention to the impact of these writings, how they shaped faith, instructed hearts, strengthened conviction, and carried the unmistakable quality of divine truth. These shared insights helped guide the early church as it discerned which writings belonged among the sacred scriptures. This process did not happen in calm conditions. The Roman Empire, threatened by the growing influence of Christianity, began targeting its people and their writings. Imperial orders demanded the destruction of Christian texts, and soldiers raided homes, gatherings, and meeting places, searching for scrolls. Many believers faced imprisonment or death for refusing to surrender the writings they treasured. Some were executed simply because they held copies of the Gospels or the letters of Paul. Their willingness to suffer rather than abandon the sacred texts shows how deeply these writings had already taken root in the hearts of the early church. They did not defend just ideas. They defended the very words that had given them hope and transformed their lives. The persecution had an unexpected effect. It clarified which writings the church valued most. Those worth dying for were clearly those considered authentic and foundational. As the pressure intensified, communities became even more diligent in copying, protecting, and sharing the recognized scriptures. Their preservation during these harsh years demonstrates that the formation of the canon was not shaped by human councils, but by the lived conviction of thousands who risked their lives for the truth they believed these writings carried. By the time the storms of persecution calmed, Christian communities from multiple regions, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, were already using the same core set of books. Lists began appearing from respected leaders in different parts of the world, not to decide what Scripture was, but to confirm what believers had long been using. By the end of the 4th century, the 27 books that make up the New Testament were widely recognized, copied, and taught across the Christian world. These lists did not create the canon. They simply affirmed the writings the churches had already tested, preserved, and lived by for generations. In this way, the Bible became a complete canon, not through a single meeting or decree, but through a long, steady process shaped by apostolic witness, faithful transmission, suffering, devotion, and centuries of recognition. The scripture that stands today is the result of a story woven through the lives of countless believers who guarded it, taught it, and trusted it to guide every generation that followed. As the biblical writings took shape and spread across generations, their survival depended entirely on the dedication of those who copied them. In the ancient world, there were no printing presses, no digital archives, and no quick methods of duplication. Every word that survived did so because scribes devoted their lives to preserving the text with extraordinary precision. Among the Jewish people, this responsibility was carried by highly trained scribes who approached the scriptures with reverence that reached into every detail. They counted letters and lines, verified spacing, and followed strict guidelines that demanded absolute accuracy. If a single mistake was found, an entire scroll could be set aside and rewritten. This discipline continued for centuries, eventually shaping the work of the Masoretes, scholars who maintained and safeguarded the Hebrew scriptures with methods so exact that their manuscripts remain some of the most reliable in textual history. Early Christians inherited this legacy of devotion, and though they faced constant challenges, persecution, scarcity of materials, and the rapid spread of new communities, they continued to copy the writings faithfully. Rooms lit by lamps, parchment stretched across wooden tables, and ink mixed carefully by hand formed the backdrop of their work. These scribes were not producing casual copies. They were preserving the central message of their faith. As the church grew across continents, so did the number of manuscripts. Some were written hastily under pressure, others with careful craftsmanship, but together they created a vast collection of texts that allowed the scriptures to endure even when individual copies were lost or destroyed. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the remarkable consistency of this transmission. The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden for nearly 2,000 years in desert caves, offered an extraordinary window into the ancient world when they were uncovered. When scholars compared these ancient Hebrew manuscripts to copies made over a millennium later, the alignment was striking. The words preserved by generations of scribes matched with a level of accuracy that astonished historians and strengthened confidence in the reliability of the Old Testament text. The New Testament enjoys even more extensive support. Thousands of Greek manuscripts, along with early translations, provide a foundation far broader than that of any other ancient writing. These manuscripts include full books, fragments, and complete collections, copied in different regions and across different centuries. Their vast number allows scholars to compare and confirm the original text with clarity unmatched by the writings of classical historians or philosophers. No other work from the ancient world has been preserved with such depth and verification. The language of Scripture also played a crucial role in its preservation. The Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew, with portions in Aramaic, languages that reflected the culture and history of Israel. The New Testament was written in Greek, the common language of the Roman world, which allowed the message of Jesus to spread rapidly and reach diverse audiences. As Christianity expanded, believers translated Scripture into new languages to make it accessible to their communities. Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and many others carried the text across borders and cultures, ensuring that the message could take root wherever the gospel was proclaimed. Through deserts, monasteries, cities, and far-reaching trade routes, the Scriptures continued their journey. Every preserved page, every copied line, every translated word tells a story of commitment and devotion. The Bible did not merely survive history, it was carried through it, guarded by countless hands and hearts who believed its message was worth preserving at any cost. Their work forms the bridge between the ancient world and the pages read today, demonstrating how a text written across many centuries became one of the most enduring and faithfully transmitted works ever preserved. As the Scriptures continued their journey through history, the next great chapter unfolded through translation. When Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, believers spoke many different languages, and not all could read the original Hebrew or Greek. To meet this need, a monumental translation emerged, one that would shape the Western world for over 1,000 years. This was the Latin version known later as the Vulgate. It brought unity to churches across Europe, giving priests, scholars, and ordinary believers a common text to read, teach, and memorize. For countless generations, this translation became the primary gateway through which people encountered the biblical story. Its influence reached into theology, literature, law, and the cultural foundations of entire nations. Centuries later, a dramatic shift swept across Europe as the desire to return to the earliest biblical sources grew stronger. This period, often associated with Reformation, brought renewed focus to the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. Scholars wanted people to read the Bible in languages they understood, not only in Latin. At the same time, a powerful invention transformed the world: the printing press. What once took months or years to copy by hand could now be reproduced in large quantities in a matter of days. As Bibles began to appear in English and other local languages, the message of Scripture spread with a speed never before seen. The words that had once been locked behind ink and parchment became accessible to farmers, merchants, families, and entire communities. This movement changed society profoundly. Literacy increased as people learned to read in order to understand the Bible for themselves. Schools, universities, and libraries grew. Ideas that shaped government, freedom, morality, and human dignity were discussed in homes and gathering places. Scripture became a book of the people, no longer reserved only for clergy or scholars. The desire for accuracy and faithfulness drove translators to study ancient manuscripts carefully, comparing sources and producing versions that captured the meaning of the original text with clarity and strength. As the centuries progressed, new discoveries deepened this work. Ancient scrolls found in desert caves and thousands of Greek manuscripts allowed scholars to build a clearer picture of the earliest biblical writings. Modern translations draw upon this treasure of evidence, offering versions that reflect both the ancient languages and the needs of modern readers. Some translations aim for word-for-word precision, others focus on conveying the meaning in natural language, and many seek to balance both approaches. Yet all share a common purpose: to bring the ancient message into the hands of people today with accuracy, clarity, and faithfulness to the original words. Through each stage of history, translation has served as a bridge, connecting distant cultures, uniting believers across languages, and ensuring that the voice carried through the Scriptures remains accessible to every generation. From parchment in dimly lit rooms to printed pages in bustling cities and digital texts reaching every corner of the world, the Bible's journey through translation stands as one of the most far-reaching efforts of preservation and communication ever undertaken. As the long journey of the Bible unfolds, from oral memories to written scrolls, from ancient manuscripts to modern translations, it invites every listener to consider deeper questions that reach beyond history. The story of Scripture is not only about ink, parchment, and preservation, it is also about the mystery of how divine truth moved through human voices. It prompts us to wonder why God chose to speak through shepherds, prophets, kings, fishermen, and scholars instead of dictating every line from heaven. Their personalities, experiences, and struggles shaped the language, yet the message carried a unity and purpose that reached far beyond them. This partnership between the divine and the human raises a profound question at the heart of Scripture's story, one that has captivated thinkers for centuries. Another question rises from the sheer endurance of the text. How does a book survive thousands of years without losing its message? Empires have fallen, languages have changed, and cultures have transformed, yet the words of Scripture have held their ground. They were copied by tired hands in dimly lit rooms, carried across deserts, hidden in caves, and protected by communities who believed they were worth guarding at any cost. Even when history pushed against its survival, the message endured with remarkable clarity, supported by countless manuscripts that echo the same truths written so long ago. The attempts to destroy these writings only deepen the mystery. Kings, emperors, and entire systems of power sought to erase the Scriptures from the world. Yet every effort failed. Instead of disappearing, the text emerged stronger, spreading farther and taking root in new hearts and new lands. The fact that persecutors could break bodies but not extinguish the words those believers carried forces us to consider why these writings survived when so many others vanished without a trace. Finally, The historical journey invites us to ask why this particular collection of ancient writings still shapes global culture, ethics, and hope long after the civilizations that first received it have gone. Laws, art, music, literature, and movements of justice bear its influence. Individuals across centuries have found comfort, conviction, purpose, and transformation in its pages. Its narratives continue to challenge the proud, uplift the weary, and inspire those searching for meaning. Few books can claim such reach, such resilience, or such impact. These questions linger long after the historical facts are told. They remind us that the story of the Bible is not only about how it was written, copied, preserved, and translated, but also about why it continues to speak with a voice that feels both ancient and timeless. The journey invites every viewer to reflect on the deeper reasons behind its survival and the purpose behind its powerful presence in the world. As we look back across the long path the scriptures have traveled, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. The Bible is far more than a collection of ancient writings. It is the record of God's dealings with humanity, spoken in deserts and mountaintops, preserved through kingdoms and empires, and carried from generation to generation by those who believed its message must never be lost. It survived because countless hands protected it, countless hearts treasured it, and countless communities recognized its power to guide, correct, comfort, and transform. Its journey from oral tradition to written scrolls, from fragile manuscripts to global translations, reflects a story woven through history with striking purpose. Every age has tried to either guard it or silence it, yet it remains. Every language it enters carries its message farther. Every new generation discovers the same truth spoken long ago, still resonating, still calling, still reaching into lives across the world. The endurance of Scripture is not an accident. It is a testimony, shaped in ancient times, preserved through trial, and delivered into our hands, so its message can continue to speak with clarity and strength. And while nations rise and fall, while cultures shift and time moves forward, its promise remains unchanged.